This chart about the Titanic shows the number of passengers and who survived, broken into different categories. So, for example, there were about 500 male third-class passengers in total, and according to the chart, only about 20% of them survived. The chart's interesting enough, and shout out to the person on Reddit who put it together. But there's actually a much more interesting story here that you might not be able to see. That's because data all by itself doesn't tell a compelling story, even if you put it into a chart. And data like this deserves a good story. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly what I did to make this data come to life. And I'll also show you what I did for this data about UFO sightings, this data from this McKinsey slide, and this data that's trying to show something. I'll show all the changes I made to these charts and exactly why I made them. Plus, I'll show you my process for turning everyday data into riveting stories. I'll teach you my best tips for conveying a clear and insightful message to your audience so that you can design charts that are compelling and interesting, because your data is only as good as the story it tells. And I'm going to teach you how to do it right. All right, for those that don't know me, my name is Paul, and I'm an instructor at Analyst Academy. We teach PowerPoint, presentation design, and data visualization to people and teams all around the world. We've got courses, and we've got live trainings, and a whole bunch of other great resources over at our website, theanalystacademy.com. So if this kind of stuff is interesting to you, make sure you check it out. All right, so let's take a look at that Titanic data. So this shows the total number of people on board the Titanic. And it's actually two charts here, both stacked column charts. We've got the female group and the male group. And within each of those, it's broken out into first-class passengers, second, third, and crew members. Now for this chart, all the right data is there, but because they chose a stacked column chart like this, it puts an emphasis on the total number of people in each group. And you can see the survival percentage, but it's not really emphasized. In other words, the story's not telling us who survived and who didn't. So first, let me break it down into a pie chart. This shows all the people on board the Titanic, and we can see that 32% of them survived and 68% of them didn't survive. That's interesting enough, but we can do a lot better. Look what happens when I break this out into different classes. This data is simple enough to where I can tell who survived and who didn't, and that alone is an interesting narrative. But I'm going to take it one step further and put this in a horizontal bar chart. And the reason why is because horizontal bar charts emphasize ranking. And this is just as we'd expect. First class passengers tend to survive the most, then it was second class, then it was third class, then it was crew. But again, this isn't the whole story. Watch what happens when I split this into male and female groups. So now we've got categories like first class female, crew male, second class male, etc. There's some interesting insights we can see in this chart that we couldn't see in the last chart. First, an obvious one. In all cases, females, regardless of class or if they're crew members, were more likely to survive than males. But you might have also noticed something really interesting, which is that for both males and females, crew members were no longer the least likely to survive. If we take just the females, crew members did better than third-class females. Likewise, if we take just the males, crews actually did better than both third class and second class. So you might be wondering, how's that possible? Let me show you. First, I'm going to change this to a 100% stacked horizontal bar chart. So now it shows survival percentage in green, and then those that didn't make it in this maroon color. But what I can do also is put this nice column at the end that shows the total number of people in each category. The important thing here is that's not the focus. In other words, the story we're trying to tell is about survival percentage. It's not about the total number of people in each group. So let's take a look specifically at the different crews. The female crew has a survival rate of 87%, whereas the male is only 22%. But there's only 23 female crew members, and there's 862 male crew members. The obvious takeaway there is that when you combine those together, it's going to be significantly more weighted to this percentage. So what that does, by combining these two together, the result is actually going to be really, really close to what this is now. But what about these other categories? Second-class females and second-class males are much closer in size. So by combining them together, you get sort of a weighted average that's in between 88% and 14%. And it's actually closer to 41%, which would put them right about here. Then same thing with the third class passengers. Third class females had a survival rate of 46%, and third class males had a survival rate of 17%. But because this is a decently sized category, not as big as this, but still enough to pull up the average, the combined weighted percentage is actually going to be 25%, which puts them just above our new crew members. So the final result looks like this. First class, as you'd expect, 62%. Second class, the number we talked about, 41%. Third class, 24%. And just below that, crew members are at 24%. It's the same data, but a much different story. And actually, I think splitting out this data into male and female is a lot more interesting. There's a lot of other charts we could have used here, and the message would have been different for each one of them. But the overall takeaway here is clear. Your data is only as good as the story it tells. All right, let's talk about these McKinsey charts real quick. This is a slide that came out during the COVID-19 pandemic that's talking about the job market and how it's going to change. All right, so the title of the slide says 74% of vulnerable jobs pay less than $40,000 per year. And you've got two charts here, a stacked column chart with the title that says level of job vulnerability by income band, and a 100% stacked column chart. So it says vulnerable jobs by income band. And the overall message of this slide is they're just trying to show how many jobs really are vulnerable, especially in those lower income brackets. And for this data, they chose a stacked column chart, which is actually a great chart to use. But in this case, it doesn't really tell the story that I think they're trying to tell. The reason why is because with a stacked column chart, it puts an emphasis on the height of each of these columns. In other words, our brains are naturally comparing how tall this is versus how tall this is and how tall this is. So a good message here might be something more about the most jobs exist in this 40 to 70K income segment. And then the secondary message would be about these percentages. Another thing that's kind of misleading about this is look how the percentages don't necessarily match up equally with the height of these sections within the column, these little gray sections. So for example, 24% and 54%, these are really close in height to each other. So it's not a good way for us to compare these different percentages. And again, that's what the message is. The lower income groups have a higher percentage of vulnerable jobs. But we can tell a much better story here by choosing a chart that emphasizes the percentage breakdown and doesn't emphasize the total. So what I did is I turned this into a 100% stacked column chart. So now I can compare these side by side. I can say for the less than 25,000 income bracket, 69% of those jobs are vulnerable, compared to 54% here. And the message is as we expect. For people with lower income brackets, they have a higher percentage of vulnerable jobs. And this seems very much in line with the theme or the overall message of the slide that they're trying to communicate, or in other words, the story that they're trying to tell, which is lower income bands tend to have more vulnerable jobs. And you see that theme continued on the right here. So this says vulnerable jobs by income band. In other words, it's taking the total number of vulnerable jobs, which would be this times this, plus this times this, etc., gives you a total of 56.9. And it's saying, how does that break down between these different groups? And the message they're trying to show here is actually what's listed in the title. 74% of vulnerable jobs pay less than $40,000 a year. And I think as it is, this chart is more or less fine, but there's definitely some ways we can make it more visually compelling. Number one, at a most basic level, let's just call out this 74% number right here. And this is what storytelling is all about. It's making it as easy as possible for the audience, your reader, whomever it is, to understand what you're trying to tell them and kind of have this visual component that matches your message. But now I want to take this one step further. So this is a 100% stacked column chart, and that's fine for seeing the visual breakdown. But a better choice here would actually be a pie chart. What we're trying to show is the percentage this makes up of the total, which is 74%. And where pie charts can be better for this is that they're a full circle, and it's a little bit easier for our brains to understand the different portions of a circle. In other words, if I have a circle that looks like this, and I shade just this portion right here, you know without doing any thinking that this represents 25%. And likewise, you could do the same thing for 50% and the same thing for 75%. So that's the next change I made. I just converted this to a pie chart. Actually, I converted this to a donut chart, which is essentially the same thing as a pie chart, except you get this section in the middle right here where you can put information. So now our charts are set up to tell a compelling story, or at the very least, a clear story about the vulnerability of jobs in lower income brackets. So now we need to make sure our messaging, the title and the subtitles, reflect that story. So I changed the title to say lower income jobs are disproportionately at risk. So I'm kind of taking it up a level in terms of the scope of what I'm trying to communicate or the story that I'm trying to tell. And now these subtitles very clearly support this title. So this says over half of jobs earning less than $30,000 annually are vulnerable. And then over here, all I had to do was just take the old title and put it right here, because that's the message we're trying to communicate. 74% of vulnerable jobs pay less than $40,000 per year. So even with just a few tweaks like this, mainly around choosing the correct chart, but also around spelling the inside out on your subtitles and again in your title, even just little changes like that can make a major difference in the story you're trying to tell or in the actual message you're trying to communicate. By the way, if you're someone who builds a lot of slides, you should definitely check out Ampler. They're a partner of ours and a tool that I've been using for a long time. Basically, they make it really easy to build slides. They've got a whole library of different slide layouts and templates and icons and anything you would need to build a high quality slide. But one of the best things about Ampler is Ampler Charts. It's this tool that makes chart building so easy. You can build almost any major chart type, and editing the chart is also really easy. That's because the tool is designed for people who actually build a lot of charts day to day. And you can add things on top of your chart that you would realistically use without having to go digging through a whole bunch of different menus. It's way easier than Microsoft's native chart building tool, and it's why I use it all the time. Ampler is actually a partner of ours, so anyone who enrolls in our courses gets 6 months of Ampler for free. But if you just want to try it out, I'll include a link down in the description for a free 1-month subscription. There's no credit card required, and it's really easy to sign up and install, so if you're interested, make sure you check it out. All right, this is an interesting one. This one's about UFO sightings in the US from 1993 to 2013. The height of each column represents the total number of sightings, UFO sightings that were reported for that year. So in 2012, there were 6,756 UFO sightings. Again, this is in the US. And I think this data is just inherently interesting. So a column chart is fine, but I think there's a more interesting story here that would be emphasized just slightly more with a different chart type. Because when you use a column chart, it puts the emphasis on each individual period. So if I were to put a message to this, I could put my title up here, UFO sightings jumped significantly in 2012 and 2013. That's one of many messages we could communicate here. But a column chart is definitely in support of this message because, again, the focus is on individual years. But I think a more interesting story here is actually the overall trend. And to emphasize that, I want to use a line chart. So notice how when I put it in a line chart, our brains naturally focus on this whole thing all at once. So instead of having a message about any of the particular years, this very clearly emphasizes how this was just rocket growth from 1993 to 2013. So that's what I'm going to put in my message here. All right, but what's wrong with this data? For me, if I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, how does this compare with the actual growth in population over the same time period? Or there could be a bunch of other variables here that we're not accounting for. So what if instead of showing UFO sightings per year, just the total number of sightings in a line chart right here, what if we instead did UFO sightings per capita? So instead I changed the data to show UFO sightings per capita. In other words, sightings per million people. And now the shape of the chart changes a little bit. So now that the data takes into account population growth, what other variables should we consider here? And again, there's a lot of different things that we could add to this chart, but one I think that's really interesting is internet adoption. So what I did is I turned this back to a column chart because what I want to show here is two different types of data in the same space. And a good way to do that is with combination charts. So now you can see that these trends match up almost perfectly. Now you gotta be careful here. Correlation does not mean causation, and I don't want to suggest too much with this data, but I do think this is an interesting insight. This is a story that you would want to tell with this kind of data. But the important message is when you change your chart type around, you can tell some pretty compelling stories. So you can see this correlation even more clearly when you plot these in a scatter plot. In other words, I'm going to take sightings per capita and plot that against our internet adoption. And you can see this very clear sort of linear upward trend and a positive correlation of 0.9959. Yeah, I would say these are correlated. This plots number of UFO sightings and distance of nearest airport. Now, this isn't number of UFO sightings per capita, it's just number of UFO sightings. And at first, it's kind of hard to see a trend. In other words, if I don't have a title here that's explaining what the takeaway should be from this chart, to the untrained eye, it's hard to understand really what's going on here. What are they trying to communicate to me? But then they did a really interesting thing that was incredibly important for communicating this story, which was they changed this axis right here to a log scale. So here's what that looks like. Now look at this trend. Very clearly a negative correlation here. In other words, you're more likely to see a UFO sighting if you're really close to the airport, and you're less likely if you're really far away from the airport. Which again, Correlation does not equal causation, but I think in this case, it's a pretty compelling insight, which is maybe people aren't seeing UFOs, maybe they're just seeing airplanes. All right, this is a chart that I found on Reddit, and when I first saw it, I sort of took it as a challenge. Obviously, there's a whole lot going on here, but I wondered, is there a better way to show this data? And if so, what does that look like? And credit to them, they packed a lot of information here. You've got the different columns that you can sort of compare against each other. You've got different colors to indicate the categories. The category names are, again, right here. Actually, I guess these are technically subcategories. So like, for example, delivery is right here, and delivery is broken into team maturity and metrics. So a lot of different layers to this data. And then this internal one right here, I'm pretty sure is showing the overall rating for each of these different categories. So in some ways, it kind of reminds me of a radar chart where it's trying to show something kind of in this radial pattern. The downside with these kinds of charts is it's hard to really make accurate comparisons. Plus, you're sort of following it around the wheel. It's not all in the same direction, especially with this chart. So it's a little bit difficult to compare, but it's also hard for me to get an overall picture of the health in each of these categories. So the very first thing I did with this is just to split it into multiple charts. Now I can see them all next to each other. And it's also, because they're all facing the same direction, it's easier for me to see all of these different areas in a single glance. Now, what's missing from this is I can't see the overall rating for each of the different categories, but we'll get there. Now, the next thing to do here is to turn these into horizontal bar charts, and that way I can rank them a little bit easier. And in this kind of layout, it's just a little bit easier to see. The other benefit is now with these horizontally, I can actually have more room to fit the categories. Sometimes you run into a situation with column charts where you have to sort of turn the category labels. It just doesn't look as good, or sometimes they're smushed, but horizontal bar charts tend to solve that problem because they give you more horizontal space. So now all my charts are ranked, so I can see which one we're doing the best at. In program leadership, we have the highest in stakeholder engagement. But like I said, we're missing the overall category totals. So what I'm going to do here is split these into their own individual slides. And this is actually an underrated lever to pull when you're trying to put an emphasis on one thing at a time. So let's take a look at this first one. This is for the delivery category. I did a bunch of things here. First of all, I made this a lot bigger, so now I can compare these categories easy. It just puts more of a focus on this. But I also put all of the main categories together and highlighted the one we're focusing on with this specific chart. What this does is it allows me to have some cohesion from one slide to the next. So I'm showing all of these categories at once, and I'm making it so clear this is the one we're focusing on. This also makes it so I can deliver a clear message right in the title. Obviously, the title doesn't have to be that. I just sort of made that up, but it does give you space to actually communicate a message. And this is a completely underrated tool, not just for slide building, but also when you're putting together a chart. Don't just put the basic information of that chart. Don't just put what's in that chart. Tell the audience what you want them to believe after viewing that chart, or what they should take away from that chart. In this case, we're doing it at a slide level, but you can definitely apply the same idea to individual charts. So now there's some cohesion from one slide to the next. So if we take a look at this next slide, it moves down the list to this one. Here you can see we're clearly on a different category. Again, this is completely blown up. There's a descriptive title right here that tells me what my overall message is. And I can see how this compares with the other categories. And of course, we're going in order here. We started with delivery, then culture, planning, program leadership, and room for these key highlights. So same thing with this one, and same thing with this one. So compare this with our original visualization, and the data is all the exact same, but by splitting it out and adding some messages to each one of these areas, it makes it a lot more compelling, interesting, easy to follow, and well-structured. All of these are hallmarks of telling a good story with your data. All right, that's gonna do it for today's video. Hopefully you found something here that was helpful and that you can now tell better stories with your data. And if you like this video, you're definitely gonna like this video where I took 3 data-heavy slides and completely redesigned them. Make sure you also check out our courses and live trainings over at theanalystacademy.com. Thanks for watching.